Okay, I think we're live for the moment, but we're just going to hold fire for a few moments. Thank you to everyone who's joined so far. Just going to wait for a few more people to join, and probably in a couple of minutes. So please bear with us. And for those who've already joined, I will say now, but I'll repeat it in a little bit. If you've got questions through the talk with Tye, then by all means post them into the Q&A area, and we'll tackle the questions as and when they come up, to keep things lively. Okay, so I think we will make a start. So good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Sixth Meaning of Light series, for the Sixth in the Meaning of Light series of talks. And of course, a huge welcome to Tye Farrow from Farrow and Partners, or Farrow Partners. Thank you very much for joining us today from Toronto. Just a little bit about the series. The Meaning of Light series is a series of talks exploring the topic of light and our connection to it. And today we're going a little bit off topic. However, we're still sticking with the subject of health and well-being, and this time in connection with the built environment. So we have the pleasure of having Tye with us today, and we'll be diving into the concept of constructing health. And constructing health is the title of Tye's latest book. I've got it here, just to make sure that everyone can see it. It's a really fabulous book, and I'm sure we'll talk about it through the talk in any case. And on one hand, I'm really looking forward to finding out more about the subject of constructing health and learning about salutogenesis and salutogenic design concepts. Definitely doesn't quite roll off the tongue, that one. And before we start, I'd like to say that, from my side, I'm at the very early stages of learning and understanding the concept of salutogenic design. But I was actually first introduced to the concept by Zach Goodman of TSP, and I'm very thankful to him for introducing it to me, because it resonated really strongly with me and the direction that we've been traveling in. And we just simply didn't know that there was a term that would so neatly encapsulate the direction that we've been heading in. So I mentioned it a moment ago, and as we've done with previous talks, we welcome questions as and when they come. So please don't hold back. Fire any questions into the Q&A area, and we'll tackle them as they come through. And it'll keep things lively on what I know is going to be a fascinating subject area. So let's dive straight in, Tye. Can you tell us a little bit about salutogenesis? Actually, I think you can tell us a lot about salutogenesis and salutogenic design. So I sort of hand over to you.
Yeah, it's great to see you, and I'm looking forward to spending some time together chatting. Indeed, salutogenesis is a bit of a complicated word to roll off your tongue, and I often sort of translate it simply into cause health, or what causes is health. I came across it about 20 years or so ago, and it put me absolutely on my back foot, because it began to sew together a lot of ideas that were sort of bumping around, but I couldn't make sense of them. So what is salutogenesis? At its core, fundamentally, it is about what makes us healthy, and with a very big emphasis on mind health. And what I mean by that is that the central concept really shifts our thinking away from a deficit-based view of health. And so much of the world that we're in, and in fact, if we think specifically about healthcare, sort of a Western evidence-based view of healthcare, it's all about stopping bad things from happening. But what about an asset-based view, which is really effectively an accelerant for health? And it was this guy, Aaron Antonovsky, about 50 years or so ago, Israeli-American medical sociologist, who coined this concept in a very, very important book that he wrote in 1979, I think, and it was Health, Stress, and Coping. And what he was trying to do was sort of that great thing we're always trying to sort out, is one of the greatest mysteries of all time in the study of people is, how do we manage to stay healthy? And I would add to that, our ability to thrive. And he came up with this complicated word, salutogenesis, which has its roots in the Latin word solus, which is really the Latin God, and in fact, Genesis, the Greek word, in which the origins is really the beginning. And it was really the opposite of that word that is in our vocabulary, and we all know it. We don't know salutogenesis, but we know the parallel one with it, which is pathogenic. And pathogenic comes from the Latin, and again, the Greek roots of the word Latin for disease, and Genesis, really the origins or the beginnings. And we have such a pathogenic view, this idea, do no harm in medicine, Western evidence, that doesn't put the bar particularly very high. But what do we do to create the conditions of which we can thrive and prosper? And, as an example is, there's 8,000 known causes or symptoms of disease that have been discovered by, modern researchers, but there's only 80 known causes or symptoms of health. Clearly, we find what we look for, but we seem to have been looking at one thing specifically. So what Antonovsky does is he reframes health as this sort of positive health generating practice. And he then goes on. I mean, he believes fundamentally that healthy societies have to be rooted deeply in health creation. And he goes on further. What about 20 some odd years later in 1987, he then lays out really the pivotal book, which he then calls Unraveling the Mysteries of Health. But he establishes the core concept of salutogenesis, which is this idea of a sense of coherence. So what's a sense of coherence? You can sort of think about it as a sense of purpose, meaning that this morning, if you didn't have a sense of purpose, if you weren't worried about getting to the office for the podcast, you wouldn't get out of bed. And if we don't have a sense of purpose, we don't have that sort of spring to get going. But it goes a bit deeper than that, this idea of a sense of coherence, which is in effectively in his words, which was a belief in one's, you know, feelings and confidence, that within your own body and your surroundings and the things that you have to deal with, that things are reasonably predictable. You can make sense about them. And in fact, you've got the resources to deal with the unexpected challenges, sort of like what we're hearing on the news every day about the pathogenic politics and sort of threats that are out us and around us. And being in Canada, it's fairly fairly real in trying to get that sense of coherence, which actually has led to great nationalism here. But what a strong sense of coherence allows us to do is really mobilize those resources to get us through the day and face some of the challenges. But the important piece about it is that it helps us along the pathway of dis-ease spectrum, but more importantly, we know the disease spectrum, but we don't use the word around this idea of health ease. How easy is it to be healthy in your daily existence? We certainly know the dis-ease, and I'm using that word very specifically with a hyphen, that spectrum. But Antonovsky's concept, if we go one step further into it, a little deeper, is this concept of a sense of coherence is buttressed with three very important concepts. It's sort of the scaffolding that holds the concept up, which is around this idea of comprehensibility, manageability, and meaningfulness. So what does that mean? Well, when you think about it regarding yourself, and we'll walk a little deeper as it relates to space, comprehensibility is that you sort of understanding what's happening, you know how to sort of make your way through things. And if you translate to the building, what does that mean? Well, when was the last time you walked up to a building and you said, where the hell's the front door? Like, how do I get into this place? And so it's both within our mind and our built environment. Manageability is a very important one because it's a behavioral dimension to it, whereby this idea that you've got the resources to meet the challenge, you can manage. And that's like walking into a building and trying to make your way through down a corridor. Where do you go, or around it? Can you manage? And there's other probably dimensions that add to that around our varying abilities. But the last piece of it, I think, is so important, both in our mind's eye as well as our environments, is this idea about meaningfulness. There's a motivational dimension that you think your life has purpose, meaning getting out of bed in the morning. But we know a lot of environments that suck the life out of us, that are draining. And we know a lot of other environments that we walk into and they give us that extra spring in our step. I mean, there's 11 million bits of information that are coming to us cognitively. Some are cognitive, some are precognitive, some are conscious, some are subconscious, and only 50 of those register. But we still know when we walk into a threshold, I don't know, think of a cathedral or something, and everything begins to lift up. You breathe in, and something's magical. And there's lots of other environments. That's the meaningfulness that is so important. So really, his whole thing, this idea of turning and looking at health creation instead of stopping bad things from happening, this idea of a sense of coherence, that we have the tools to manage, but more importantly, the scaffolding around comprehensibility, manageability, and meaningfulness. And then these things, if we just step one a little further, they've some people, if they want to go a little deeper into, there's two other concepts that I think are very important that are built on salutogenesis. One was developed by the great American architect researcher, stress recovery theory, and he begins to tie into when we're under very stressful conditions, that he gets into natural environments that can support us. And then building on the same concept, two very important environmental psychologists, Rachel and Stephen Kaplan with a K, which is really worth looking up, attention restoration theory, ART for short. And they really dive deeply into mental fatigue and concentration, and in fact being in nature, or in fact looking at it. And we can get a little further maybe into biophilia in a minute, but they then tie into these other concepts, which then we can get further into voluntary and involuntary attention. But that, in not so much of a nutshell, is really around what salutogenesis is, like a tabletop, three legs, sense of coherence, three legs supporting it, which is that idea of manageability, meaningfulness, um, um, and really into the comprehensibility side of it.
So you mentioned do no harm, which is obviously the Hippocratic Oath,
Absolutely.
which we stick. Yeah, we understand. We've come across it so often within medicine, but do you think such a thing should exist within architecture? I mean, I've thought about it in the concept of light today, that maybe we should be talking about do no harm. But yeah, what are your thoughts in terms of a Hippocratic Oath and architecture? Is that sort of a natural pathway with things like salutogenic design?
It's do no harm is not good enough. I
Okay.
mean, clearly we have to do no harm. I mean, if I'm designing your office building, I don't come to you and say, do you want two fire exits so that there's a fire in your building? You have a choice. I mean, that's a standard of care, that you have that choice. I don't come to you and say, would you like the carpet that off gases or the one that doesn't off gas? And the reason for that is we know about that. We know that we should be building buildings that are high performance. They have a very good envelope. They don't waste energy, because that is responsible. So that maybe ties into that category. But we talk about high performance buildings. What about human performance? Buildings that stimulate learning, memory, social interaction, empathy, creativity. With your team, do you want them just to be in an environment that does no harm, and sort of numbs them, which we know in fact a variety of environments do, and specifically around the lighting? Or do we want ones that are accelerants, jet fuels, that bring people together to work with all of the complex problems that we have in all aspects that we view our society today, and back to the threats that we're seeing in our political environment, not just on my back door? We've got to raise the bar. We have to push further, or we'll perish.
And we talked about it just before we started to talk, and I think you're right. We have to go beyond doing no harm. Yeah, one of the things that we see, yeah, and we're only a small section of the industry. We're supplying luminaires and light into spaces, but we talk an enormous amount. Everyone talks an enormous amount about sustainability, and yeah, the question that sits in my mind is what about human sustainability? Do we talk about human sustainability in the same way as we talk about material sustainability? Yeah, I just wonder what your thoughts are on that concept.
It's we're siloed. We know design has a significant impact on our ecological health and the choices we make. We know that that's fundamental. We know that design has a significant impact on our physical health. Do you walk into a building that in front of you is a high speed, elevator, or is there a generous stair with good quality of light, that you can zip up and down if you want to? We know design has a significant impact on societal health. Our profession has been so good at zoning and keeping these people away from these people, which is fundamentally problematic. But we know that design has a significant impact on mind health, and this emerging intersection of neuroscience and architecture that's only about 20 years old. Or, I mean, neuroscience is about the science of the brain. Um, um, the cognitive sciences are really about the science of the mind, and so there's a subtle differentiator there, but I think it's very important. If we look at activating optimal health, if you look at the concepts of planetary health that came out with the Rockefeller Center and Lancet a little bit ago, but they look at the fundamental interconnection and intertwining of ecological health, physical health, societal health, and mind health. And this idea that it's um, for 3,000 years of human history, which I outline in our book, we have had effectively a salutogenic view of everything around it. And it's arguably only about the last 150 years, maybe a little longer when we get into the rationalist view, that we've had more of a pathogenic view. Effectively, René Descartes in the mid 1600s, the French philosopher, he was a guy that came in and said, okay, the mind and the body are separate. And we know that's not true, but I think that sort of rolled into that view that, we as human species and our surrounding environments, are totally separate. And we know that's not true. I mean, for 3,000 years of human history, if you look at indigenous views of how we viewed health, it was you look at indigenous North American or Canadian views, and there was these interlocking circles. In fact, the medicine wheel is a circle because it has ecological health, societal, mind health, all of these things together. But we've just narrowed down, and our profession is really bad at it because all the lenses that you view anything good is singularly in that area. Not that that's not important, it is. But if we are going to be relevant, if we are going to be accelerants for health creation that enhances, again, social, creative, empathy, all of these aspects, we need to widen the circle to create places where we can thrive and prosper. And that's really the fundamental basis of salutogenesis.
So yeah, I think I don't think there are many countries or economies around the world that aren't suffering from, the aging population. And it would seem natural that, health creation needs to be, a core concept, because productivity at some point, with age is gonna drop off. And I think this is where, you know, architecture and design can have a fundamental impact on, you know the health of nations long term. You know, how do you think? Do you already have it in mind how you go about delivering that, as an architect?
You are absolutely right. But I mean, there's a couple areas that we can cover on that. One, on the longevity side, that we're seeing that bubbling to the surface, a lot of interest in it. An economist from the London School of Economics just did a really interesting study that he looked at, instead of saying, okay, you're 65, you should retire, but looking at both the brain power, the economic input, the ability to enhance people's health continuously, not only what that does from stopping our spending in the pathogenic side, dampening the curve on the health care side, but he was looking at the economic benefit, the salutogenic benefit of why this is so important. And it was off the charts, like billions and billions and billions. But how does that get applied to our thinking about what we should be doing with an older population? We're involved in a project that really is stimulating me tremendously. A Swiss economist has hired us to develop intergenerational housing model. Why does he want to do it? Because he believes it is a social imperative, because we know the Surgeon General in the United States recently, it says, that if you're in your 30s or so and you have kids, that there's an epidemic of stress that is going over that population. I mean, there's all kinds of stress things and naturally in that area. But he believes, and he believes the economics on it also, that if you created, housing that has a certain amount of housing for older people, a certain amount of housing for people that have young kids, and then within that, there are a number of things such as kindergartens or places to come together or to share. They have to be scaled in a specific area. But what happens is there is the evidence from an economic standpoint, there's a learning standpoint, and there's cognitive development that says that if older people are near younger people, they live longer and they're more cognitively aware. The younger kids, because they have these older mentors, which aren't just their parents, that they learn better and do better in education and schooling. And the parents aren't stressed out of rushing home because, they have to get somebody, because you've got a natural built-in in an infrastructure. Is this a new concept? Well, no, it's like a lot of the old communities we have. But this guy is developing this concept as effectively like a franchise model. The first project we'll do will be in Portugal. But this thing is not just about affordable housing, which we have a terrible time with. It's not just about housing and putting older people over there. Anywhere that you create one place for one type of people or one age of people, a ghetto, it doesn't work out particularly well. And so this idea for me is such a big, frothy idea that is transformative.
So there's a comment that's come through from Mary Louise. So hello, Mary Louise. Nice to see you joining us. Thank you very much. So she's mentioned, I think that combined housing principle that you're describing is already being built in places like the Netherlands, and she thinks it's a great idea. But so, are you aware of projects that are being built like this?
You're absolutely right, and we have studied them. I'm not putting this out as the newest greatest idea in the entire world, because there are fantastic pockets that are happening. But it isn't happening in my backyard. It's not happening south of us. And in the UK, I don't think there's a lot of examples of intergenerational housing. Um, and so similarly, like the idea of salutogenesis, it's not a new idea. These things are out there, but we need to bring them clearly into the mainstream.
There's
Netherlands has some extraordinary examples that have been going for a very long period.
So Mary Louise has just made another comment. How do we get house builders in the UK today to do this? Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know whether you've got an answer for that one.
Well, I think there's a couple things. One is about value and affordability. And so there's value and values, that creates value. With this economist that we're working with, the project, I mean, the whole concept of the building is they're buildings that are wrapping around a courtyard effectively with a kindergarten community space in the middle. But on a fairly dense piece of land, from the inside courtyard, you can go from ground to roofscape, and you can walk up and hike over the entire building all the way up to the 7th floor. And along that, there's a variety of community assets and gardens and a number of things, meaning that there's very little land that you're giving out to common space, but you're creating it in a very dense area, meaning that you get an effectiveness of the footprint of the building. The unit sizes, the suite sizes, are very, very specific. They can only be so big, but we put tons of emphasis on the qualitative aspects of it. It's all mass timber, it's all prefabricated, delivered to site. And so his thing is, you can do this, you can have these great ideas, but if you can't afford to build them, they're not going to happen, back to her comment. So the economic side is a pillar of what it is, but the social and the qualitative aren't, these things that are roadkill along the way.
So I'm gonna sort of thank you very much, by the way, Mary Louise, for the questions. In my very simplistic mind, I look at life in the context of light, nutrition, exercise, oxygen, and sleep. But actually, the bit that I've missed there is environment, quite clearly. They all combine into the environment, but the environment is the sort of the overarching aspect of that. Um, and it's actually a friend of mine, Nick Rutherford, who introduced me to the terminology. It wasn't my terminology, although I shared it with you the other day. Ultra process buildings. How do we move away from you know developing ultra process buildings?
Well, and we've talked about it, and I think your phrase has stuck with me, and it's very, very powerful, and it will be used. But what we talked about is that I often, and in the book, I have a picture of a hamburger, and often in talks I'll put that up on the screen, and I'll say to people, what do you see? And they say, oh, well, maybe that's lunch, or um, and and my response is that it's a symbol of a lot of things that we build. It's transactional. A hamburger is transactional. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that it's functional. And we need our buildings to be functional. I mean, that's what we're always told. A burger's great because you don't need a plate, you don't need a fork and a knife, you can hold it and you consume it. It does what it's asked to do. It gives you protein, gives you some calories,
Some protein, maybe.
some, some, but what it does, back to your point about a very ultra processed food, is the chemicals and the additives and the sodiums. Well, let me step back. Once you finish it, after an hour, you feel empty. You're left feeling empty. And in fact, the ultra processed nature damages your body. So it's doing singularly what it's asked for. And that's what a lot of our buildings, okay, what do our buildings need to be? They need to be functional. Okay, of course they do. What else? Well, maybe they should add that spring in your step back to, collaboration and social. They need to create the conditions of which you can thrive and prosper. Our buildings aren't like a lot of them, that smoothie that you have in the morning that has blueberries in it and pomegranates and all of these things that repair and supercharge your organs. And then when you begin to look at light, you had that fantastic talk with Scott Zimmerman. I had a chat with him. He's extraordinary, an eye opener. We focus about light and a lot about our circadian rhythm, and we shouldn't have the different colors of light at different times of day. His work, and certainly where you are, is this near infrared light that repairs, the energy center within each in each cell. But back to your point, we say, okay, we need, LED lights to save energy, but they cut that near infrared spectrum out, meaning that they're not repairing, giving all the tools to repair our body. And his work, where he's going, is to quantify what is the health impact. And he's looking then on the glass, the films we put in, and then the window blinds we put in, which stops all of that stuff from feeding us. And so back to your idea of ultra processed buildings, we're just singularly focused on one area. Not that that's not important, but let's just, pull open the door a bit wider to see how we can create the conditions to thrive and prosper and what causes health. Back to the idea of salutogenesis.
And so I'm just gonna say, well, yeah, the ultra processed buildings, yeah, that wasn't my thought. It was definitely Nick's thought. But yeah, as we've spoken before, and when I saw the burger in constructing health, yeah, it rung such a strong parallel, because I look at our sort of light environments today, our artificial light environments today, and I have a slide in one of my presentations which is exactly that. It's a fast food, it's a burger, it's fries, and it's a milkshake. And I think in lighting terms today, if we consider what ourselves as solar collectors, and I'm using Scott's term here, solar collectors, we've evolved over under the full spectrum of sunlight. And when we're out in sunlight, we're nourished. When we're indoors in artificial lit environments today, we are reduced to a visible part of the spectrum for efficiency. Absolutely, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be efficient, but there are other things that going on, and so as a consequence, we're fed, but we're not necessarily nourished. And I think there's a big distinction there. So Kevin, if you want to plow in at some point here, you're more than welcome to jump in. Um, but yeah, I've had this thought that there is a nutritional aspect to light, and maybe there's a sort of a nutritional aspect to environmental, sort of
let's
spaces that are created.
let's walk a little deeper into that. And uh, there's effectively three things that I discovered in the book that are around that, which were real eye openers to me. And they're around mice, whales, and Central Park in New York. So just stick with me a little bit and see,
They're quite diverse. They're quite diverse.
and let's see if we can make sense of that. So why don't we start with whales? The one stat that I discovered in the book, it came out of the Chan School of Public Health, was that at Harvard, that we spend more time indoors than most whales spend underwater. Isn't that amazing? But but we're really worried about the marine life, because we know that all the rubbish that we put in the water, we can understand that it poisons them. And you think of all the microplastics and stuff. We understand those fundamentally, that environment that you talked about, that feeds, nourishes, or doesn't, the mammal life, but we don't think about it the same way of our own our own environment. So let's go a little further and let's go into something a little smaller, the mice. So there was a Canadian in the 1940s called Hebe, who he was a scientist, and he had white mice in lab cages, those shiny silver boxes with the lights on all the time. And he decided to take some of those mice home. And he put them in what he termed an enriched environment, which you can imagine is a place for little mice with colorful things to run around, and tubes and stuff. So he brings these mice home, and in a very short period, what he finds is the mice are happier, they're better at solving problems, they have less health issues, socially more interactive, and he sort of coins this term. Then another lady for me who's really interesting in the stuff we're looking at, a lady called Diamond at the University of California, Berkeley, and she takes this study work further. And what does she do? She takes some of the lab mice and she puts a group of them in a regular mice cage, that has a running wheel, and stuff, maybe a drinking bottle or something that. She puts a group in that. She then puts some mice in an impoverished environment, which is effectively the lab cages. And then she puts some in an enriched environment, like we've been talking about. And then after 30 days, only 30 days, she dissects the brains. What does she discover? The mice that are in the regular cage, the synapse connections, which are very important connections between the neurons, they don't change. They're the same as they were 30 days before. What does she find out with the mice that are in the enriched environment? This is only after 30 days. The synapse connections between the neurons, they grow at a rate of around 25%. 25% because of the environment, like it's changing your physical structure, and the cortex that's on the top of our brain, which is very important for a whole variety of things, it begins to grow and strength. This is only after 30 days. What about the mice that are in the impoverished environments? In fact, the synapses begin to shrivel and wilt the same way that a plant does without sunshine. And so this is a short period. Okay, that's mice. What about, is it relevant to people? Very famous court case. California goes to the Supreme Court, and it's about solitary confinement. There's these three guys called the Angola Three, and extraordinarily, they're in solitary confinement. They're only allowed out 1 hour a day. The room has no windows in it. One guy's in solitary confinement for 10 years. One guy's in solitary confinement for about 15. And this other guy, King, is in it for 29 years. 29 years,
It's a long
except
time.
except for 1 hour a day, goes to the Supreme Court, and they have to prove that solitary confinement is cruel and unusual punishment. And the only way they can prove it effectively is that it changes your physiology and biology. What happens to him? His hippocampus, very important for memory, spatial orientation on the bottom of the brain, it shows that it's significantly damaged. And in fact, if you take that a step further, right now in certain countries, there's a thing called white room torture. What do they do? Think of you leaving tonight and you walk out to your car. Outside, it's a bit dark. You pull up to your car in the parking lot, and a van screams up. They grab you, handcuff you, put a hood on your head, and throw you into the back of the van. They then race you to a space, and they throw you into a room that is all white. White lights, I suspect LED, white walls, white furniture, you're in white clothes, and all you hear is your own breathing. And just to ensure that they damage your mind, they feed you white rice on white plates. They don't they don't damage you physically, like they don't abuse you, but after about 60 days, they throw you in the van and they drive you and they drop you back by your car in your parking lot, and you're physically damaged. It takes years and years to rebuild, because the environment, like the poor lab mice, the physiology, changes you. So what we need to begin to do, back to lighting, like in the white room torture, through to these other things is we have the ability to grow the synapses, or we have the ability to change them. But this isn't just, making you feel good or not feel good, but it's changing your physiology. And one last piece of the puzzle on that I need to just quickly finish is, what about Central Park? How did that
Yes.
fall
I
into
forgot.
the?
Yeah. You'd completely captivated me in the right room thing. So yeah, I'd forgotten about Central Park.
So let's move on to the positive side of environmental enrichment and move out of the negative side of it. Central Park. What do we think of Central Park? We go to New York and we say, okay, we have to do all kinds of things, but then we got to go to Central Park and we have to wander around because it's amazing, and the activities and all the other things in all different seasons is fantastic. And when we think of Central Park, we think, okay, who designed Central Park? And we think, wow, Frederick Law Olmsted, who's effectively the founder of contemporary or modern landscape architecture. And we think of him as a landscape architect. But in researching the book, the extraordinary thing for me is Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't a landscape architect. He is not a trained landscape architect. In fact, he was the founder of a thing called the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which is forerunner to the Red Cross. He was an early public health pioneer. But what his two sons were in fact landscape architects. They set up the landscape architecture program at Harvard, one of the first in the country. But he was a public health pioneer, but he was using design. He was using design to enhance health, ecological health, societal health, because we're coming together there, physical health, because we want to move there, and mind health. And certainly we know mind health as it ties into biophilia, the emerging area, or that idea that we were talking about attention, attention restoration theory and um, stress recovery theory that ties into that. But this idea that this guy who we think is a designer isn't a designer, but in fact he is. So the question is, am I an architect or am I a public health activist? We need to, I believe, as a profession, is to shift our view that I'm a public health worker on behalf of the wider community, as opposed to an architect. So
Interesting.
there's there's mice, whales, and Central
And
Park.
Central Park. So fascinating stuff. And sticking on environment, because Mike Peterson put in a question. Thank you very much, Mike. There's a growing conversation on the subject of sustainability versus beauty, and that beauty trumps sustainability. If it isn't beautiful, it isn't sustainable. Do you agree?
um, I like the direction that he's going, but um, sustainability we know is a bigger concept. And the word might not be the right one. Beauty is, which I write about in the book, as we all know, is in the eye of the beholder. And I get a little worried about beauty, the discussion around it. And in fact, one of your brethren in the UK has a campaign about stopping boring buildings. And I get a little worried about that, because if you look at boring and beauty, my view of what that is might be very, very different. And not that I don't think beauty is important, but I want to flip that around. And that's what I write about in the book, is the elements of environmental enrichment. And that, if I step back from that, that there's a lady, Barrett, a Canadian, who in fact has a brilliant lab now in the United States, which has laid out this thing called the constructed theory of emotion. I encourage everybody to dive into it. She's got a couple great books that are very digestible. But what's the constructive theory of emotion? Effectively, she says that there is an outer world, everything around us, our environment, and there's an inner world, which is everything that's sort of happening within here. And she says that there's inputs that come from the outer world that come into the inner world. What are those things? Well, those are all multimodal sensorial aspects. So there's sound, there's scent, there's vision, but also there's two very, and all the others we know of, but there's two that are very important with kinesthetics, which is our movement in space, because our mind is what's known as embodied, and we'll get around that. So our brain is in our skull, our mind is embodied. It goes through our interoceptive, proprioceptive, and necroceptive systems. And then the other is our vestibular system, which is really about where we are in space and balance and how we perceive things. So all of those things are inputs. And then what happens? It goes into this thing, the inner world, and we make predictions of what we should do. Meaning, do we want to hang around that space or do we want to run for our life? But the most important thing is that they are shaped, our predictions are shaped by cultural aspects, things we've learned or things we've experienced, meaning that your and my perception of something that's good or bad might be very different. What's an example of that? Well, if I look at, say, a Georgian building, you and I look at a Georgian building, and maybe you and I think of columns and a pediment. Maybe in the States, you can picture a white pediment and white columns. You and I probably view that from a Western view as probably, maybe it's a courthouse, maybe it's City Hall, but it's a symbol of order and good government and stability. Let's take that exact symbol into the deep south of the United States or South Africa, of which we've done some work. That symbol effectively is probably the parliament buildings that enacted um, uh, all of the laws in apartheid, or in fact, you can look in the deep south of the United States, all of the problems that we see there. But that exact symbol doesn't is the same. So is that beautiful? I might think it's beautiful, but somebody else might be very different. Because what that is we build relationships. And so I think the way, in fact, in our book and the research that I've gone into, the way you and I build meaningful person to person relationship, the way our mind builds person to place relationship, in fact, is very, very similar. So in the book, what we dive into is psychological output studies and relations between doctors and patients. What are the characters and qualities of meaningful relationships that are generous and have variety and vitality, a sense of occurrence? They're natural, they're silent and still and solid. Those things have a relationship to how we view arguably beautiful relationships, but they're built on qualities and characteristics. And what are those things like? Let me put it into another context that might be a little easier. They're like ingredients in food. They're not the recipe. So beauty, saying, well, beauty has a recipe for something, they don't. Is that what I've laid out is in our research is these elements which are like ingredients that we put in food. What's an example? Think of cinnamon. Well, cinnamon, let's go back to the Western view. Well, I think of Christmas time. I think of a spiced goose. Maybe I think of a spiced wine. But it has that sort of semi-sweet, sort of woody flavor to it. That's on our tongue. We taste it. But let's take cinnamon and let's go to an Indian biryani. Let's go to India. And the Indian biryani is very different than the spice goose, the spiced wine, and the contextual, back to the things, cultural, things we've learned, things we've experienced. But that taste of sort of that little earthy, woody, maybe a little sweet, that flavor is exactly the same. Let's go back to the concept of generosity. Well, generosity, if I look in where I am today, it's snowy out. And in fact, if there was a canopy on the street that kept the snow out, or in fact the rain, that's generous. What if I go into the middle of Africa, for example, smoking hot? It would be nice to have a tree-lined road that gives me a little bit of shade, for example. But generosity isn't just, the question is, okay, Tye, is it just about giving more? You have to have more. There's that Pulitzer Prize winning Chilean architect who does affordable housing, amazing affordable housing. He builds these things which are called a half house. And basically there's walls and a roof over it, but he only builds half the house and the other half is open. And what that does is you buy it and you've just got married, you don't have a lot of money in your jeans, but after you have your first kid and you've got a little more money, you can fill out a bit of the half house for another bedroom. And then you get another kid and you could add a little more because you need an extra bedroom and a playroom. And then you can add a bit more because your mother-in-law, she needs somewhere to live and she's going to look after the kids. Then you can add more. That's generous because the building allows you to do more. And the other thing I need to add to this is healthy buildings or generous architecture, you need a healthy design process and you need a generous design process, which brings more people, more voices into the equation. But that's looking at that in element. Look at generosity through the lens of beauty again. Well, we can begin to connect the dots around that. Variety and vitality and a sense of occurrence. That relates to beauty in a sense of degrees. But it's how, back to you, how you view the inputs, the stimulus, multimodal, multisensorial, scent, um, but it also relates to what your filter is. Even if you look at pattern, I mean, look at all of the great stories in India, or if you look at patterns, say back to Africa, you know, a lot of patterns that are really amazing on our clothing that might be pretty intense through your lens of what you see. And if you take a minimalist environment, or maybe say Georgian, and you put it in South in an African context, it might be extremely boring. But we don't. We have to focus on, I believe, how we build relationships. And so if we want environments that stimulate curiosity, collaboration, what are the characters and qualities of a relationship, your and my relationship, that would be collaborative? So explain those in words, and then let's begin to explore what does that look like in our built environment. But there is, like that taste of cinnamon, that are things like generosity that begin to be universal. And I'll just add finally, if you look at solid and still and silent relationships, look at the relationships, you know, with your partner. And what are those still and intimate relationships? How do you describe them? After coming out of COVID, we can begin to understand those ones that were wonderful and the ones that were deadly, and in fact led more into the mental health and disease side as opposed to the mind health and the asset side.
So when you
Was
brought
that
up
a good
cinnamon,
enough answer
that
for our friend
I think
Mike?
I think it was a very good answer, Mike. I don't know. Do you want to sort of just message in and say if you're happy with the answer? But there's a couple of things that came out.
Tell him we have to meet for a biryani, I think.
um, so a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned cinnamon, and I'm thinking a cinnamon roll straight away. So nothing to do with
Well, there you
the
go.
biryani.
That's right.
Um, the the question that then comes into my mind, and before I go to my question, sorry, I'm gonna pick up because Kevin's just messaging. So thanks for this. Lots to agree with. Thanks for the mention of IR benefits to mitochondrial health. How do we add infrared and near infrared back in an LED world? Sorry, let me just expand this. Is it a lighting issue, or can this be delivered through radiant heating solutions? So yeah, there's a question for you. I don't know. Obviously, Tye, you caught up with Scott Zimmerman last week. Yeah, I'm sure Scott has spoken a lot about mitochondrial benefits from infrared. So yeah, I'll fire it over to you. How do we do it? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the first answer is there's a lot of smarter people than me in that zone, like Scott, that is doing absolutely extraordinary work that has really put me on my back foot on thinking about our surroundings. But what I do is The short answer to that question is let's move out of silos. And let's not just think of, okay, it's near infrared, infrared. It's a lighting solution, as the question has said, that it also relates to heating, and I'm sure there's a variety of other pieces of the puzzle about it. But we need to look at how all of these pieces relate and try and use them all, as opposed to saying it's just one piece or another piece in the overall equation. I don't think I've got the interest, and I'm wading into the water around these subject areas. But I think that might be somebody in your seventh Atrium talk that you'll need to bring in to say, how do we do it in multimodal? But I think the question is leading down to a path that is very important.
And I think maybe that's where the subject comes back to, and I'm not suggesting we go back into it, but human sustainability. We focus so much on certain metrics, and we sort of ignore the real consequences of chasing those metrics. And in fact, this morning there was a report on the BBC, coming back to type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, and whilst it's not, I can't sit here and say it's only about light. It's a number of things. It's nutrition, it's exercise, it's sleep, it's combination. But light plays a part in that, and we've learned from Glenn Jeffrey's studies that red and near infrared light has an impact on blood glucose levels through mitochondrial sort of stimulation. So that brings us then back to human sustainability, environmental concepts, and how we develop that environment. But I want to, if you don't mind, Tye, I want to just touch on something. You were talking about generosity in designing a salutogenic building, or a building with salutogenic concepts. How generous does the client have to be?
I don't. You mean adding more concept? It's not
Well,
about
not not
adding
not not
more.
not 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 necessarily adding more, but are we, our budgets, does the client have to be of a certain mindset to take on the challenge of not the challenge, but uh the energy to make something different? How generous in mindset does the client have to be to
Sure.
open themselves up to this sort of you know different approach to designing the building?
Important to frame that. And let me step back. The work that we do, for the most part, is for purpose or public organizations that don't have any money. Like all of them, there isn't enough money. That's for sure. And that is like our shopping list. Our shopping list, we've got lots on it, and we can't afford it all. And we have to make decisions that are important. But let me give you an example, and the numbers. I know that this is a study. I forget where it's out of, but it looked at total cost of building elements. Let's take an example. So if you were going to spend $1, £1 on the capital cost of a building, and so I'm talking to you, you're the owner, and you're making a decision to build an environment, and you've got limited resources to spend. You've only got so much money, you can't spend any more, which gets back to our shopping list. How do you make decisions? So I come to you and say, okay, you're going to spend $1, £1 on that building, €1. What's it going to cost you in your long-term operating costs, mechanical, electrical systems, all of those system decisions, the envelope on the building, all the rest. So you spend $1 on the capital costs, construction costs. What do you spend on the operating costs, say over 12 years? So if it's $1, €1, £1 on construction costs, the operating costs are $5. Wow, that's a lot of money. So where are you going to focus your energy, your money? A few ruples, you're going to make sure that it's spent on reducing the operating costs. But let's take that a little further. You're running your business. If you take that same horizon, what do you spend on the staff costs within that building? So 1 on capital, 5 on operating. What's it on your team within it? Is it $10? $50? Is it $100? Is that 150? It's 200. So if one ruble out of that dollar, it can have impact on the 5, but you're doing something. The building is to hold people. And if one little bit of that money is spent, the exponential impact on people, back to creativity, empathy, social interaction, memory, creativity, learning. Remember those, the mice in the enriched environments, the synapse? That's only 30 days. If you do this over the span of a couple months or a year, the impact on human performance is specific. I fundamentally believe we need to find a new path forward. Fundamentally, where placemaking is seen as a health generating system, that at its roots, it's an accelerant for our biological, our physical, and psychological health. We need to start viewing architecture not by what it is, but what it does. And what it can do is its ability to cause health.
Amazing. Maybe that leads me into you know um, Winston Churchill, who's quite well known for, I'm quoting him, we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. I think in today's world, there's probably no better reality than that.
Well, it's I think the interesting thing then comes to this area of the intersection of neuroscience and architecture. And it's effectively only formally about a 20-year thing. There's a body, it was in the US, in San Diego. There was a body created up, which was a union, effectively came out of people out of the Salk Institute in San Diego, the American Institutes of Architects. They created this thing called the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. And it's worth looking up on the website. There's lots of resources there to get information. But it's an intersection really of people in the neuroscience, the cognitive sciences, with architects to begin to understand the science. And they've got a lot of rigor on what environments are doing to changing our biology, our physiology. And so this suddenly isn't something that's sort of wishy-washy of how something makes you feel. It's actually beginning to look at of in fact how it changes, and for me again, importantly, how it creates the conditions of which we can thrive and prosper. That gut feeling in your stomach, that gut feeling that something is wrong. What is that? That is that's your interceptive systems. Your body is a radar dish. Remember, we talked about the 11 million bits of information, some of it conscious, some of it preconscious. That is beginning to tell, your body is telling your mind. Remember, your mind isn't body. Your mind is connected down through to, in fact, enzymes in your stomach. It's a communication system. If you go, some say there's an ancient primordial brain that's within us, back to the idea of fight and flight, when there was a saber-toothed tiger around the corner, that all of these instincts, your body's, this antenna, it's telling you to do something. And so this study of neuroscience, cognitive science is getting into the depth. Some say that we're in the golden age of neuroscience, because we can quantify these things. And we don't need to sort of cut the top of the lid off and poke in to see what's happening there, because we've got all of these great fMRI or other things that can quantify, and there's a lot of wearables that make it very simple that when you walk into space, you can begin to see what your systems are doing. And some of that is around saliva, some is around skin conductance, some is around eye tracking, some is micro facial reactions. Some are actually looking at, through fMRI stuff on what your brain is actually doing. Another area that I'm really interested in is heart rate variability. All of the wearables like the rings and stuff. It's so simple to be able to look at your heart rate variability. For me, that's very important as it relates to space, because heart rate variability, let me step back. Heart rate, if you have a raised heart rate, we often think that has a relationship to stress. So if you walk into something and your heart rate's going up, it might be around that. But what I'm interested is the salutogenic side, meaning that you're walking into an area and you're falling in love. Let me step back. You walk down the street and you turn the corner and you see your high school lover. What happens? Your heart rate, hopefully if it ended well, your your heart rate variability goes off the charts. Like, or Valentine's Day coming up and all of that, your heart rate variability will probably be very high. How does that happen in environments? Because the heart rate variability, heart rate goes at a regular pace. Heart rate variability, it's slightly off, but it's a positive way because it does a lot of great physiology things. How do we begin to infuse that specifically in the environments? Because when you walk through that threshold of the door and you come into the office in the morning, what happens if your heart rate variability goes up? Because it does all kinds of wonderful things, regenerative, to your body. There's very little research, as far as I know, and a group in the States that has all of this wearable that we're in the early stages with. There isn't very much done in heart rate variability around space, and it's something that we're just on the doorstep ourselves on beginning to capture, and something that's very, very interested to me. But that will tie into light, and I'm sure that the near infrared light, and in fact the infrared in the earlier discussions also.
Yeah, and I think yeah, with sort of with the infrared and the sort of mitochondrial function that Kevin was talking about earlier, there we start to move into things like quantum biology, but that's for another day. So Tom's
But
asked a
but
very
but to your
go on.
point,
Yeah.
is now these things, we've got the tools and the technologies and the way to map them, but also to see how they're interconnected. And the important thing, back to architecture, neuroscience and architecture, all of these things used to be siloed,
Yeah.
and they've siloed, back to our friend Rene Descartes, who said the mind and the body, and the rationalist view is we've had this rational view, but if we go back again to that concept of Aboriginal views of what health is, where all of these circles, we're getting back into the zone on realizing that science and architecture and light and body and mind, we can all
Are
bring
all
them
connected.
together and share.
Yeah. So Tom, hello, Tom. Tom Elliott has just posted a question. How do architectural education and building standards need to evolve to embody and encourage a salutogenic approach?
Very important issue to raise. So the American Institute of Architects, a couple of people who I know, who I admire greatly, they have just brought into, it was just passed at the last American Institute of Architects conference, which was embedding the idea of health, not healthcare, but health into standards, the morals, the educations, the ethics of the association. And what that is, currently right now, it's effectively do no harm. The professional architects, we need to ensure that there's life safety, that buildings don't fall down. Well, that's still a pretty low standard. And what's happened is with this resolution is that it's just changed the game fundamentally, that it's not good enough just to do no harm, but we need to cause health. We have to have a salutogenic view. But to the second part of the question, which Ray Pentecost, he's the director of Texas A&M's health design program, a guy that's promoting this and one of the guys who was involved with it. He's saying the problem is that we've now adopted this, that it needs to be in our education systems, but there's very little of the evidence, the pieces that you can grab to infuse and teach people. So in fact, that's part of the reason of my book. So, I did my undergrad, I did a Bachelor of Architecture at the University of Toronto. I then went on to do a Master of Architecture and Urban Design at Harvard at the Graduate School of Design. And just before the pandemic, we've got a lot of work in Europe all the way through to Israel. And I came across this program that was in its first year at the University of Venice, which was a Master of Neuroscience applied to architecture. I went and met the director, it was in the first year, and I told him where I was, and he said, yes, you can enroll. And in fact, I could go back to school a week a month. And it was amazing. So between serving the clients, I would be in school uh, with 15 people. It was in the second year, and I was sitting in the same room with some of arguably the greatest neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, sociologists, and you know 10 or 15 of us having debates around it. And it was extraordinary eye-opener for all of those things that I knew in my gut that we know about space. But suddenly it gave me the tools and in fact where the research was. And so I thought, I need to disseminate it. So I'm the first Canadian architect with a Master of Neuroscience applied to architecture degree, which is all about the phenomenon of how we interact with our space. So I decided I need to disseminate it. So the book, Constructing Health, 80,000 words, 300 pages, 450 illustrations and diagrams. Like you showed, it's big, 11 inches square, 30 centimeters.
Anybody missed it? It's here.
And the reason is that when you open that book, it's very immersive as an experience. And why is that important? Well, if the subject is about the phenomenon of experiencing space, the experience of the book has to be the same. And the important thing for me also is that it's some of the reviews have been great in scholarly journals as well as public press. But the one out of Brazil that really excites me is that it isn't pretentious and it's very easy, back to food, to digest. It doesn't give you a heartburn because it's too hard to go through the concept. Not that it's dumbed down, but it's very specifically trying to put these concepts in a way that you can understand them, but importantly, action them also. It's a book that can be a textbook for students or professionals. Think of going back to the American Institute of Architect, and this is a new initiative. It can also be so for students in cognitive or design professions or studying. It can also be for professionals, but more importantly, it can be a resource for the public, because once you see something, you can't unsee it. And one of the most exciting things for me is the main bookseller in Canada, coast to coast, everywhere. Their chief bookseller chose it as that person's number one choice for the fall spring season. And you can walk into any bookstore and there it is up front. Why is that important to me? It's important to me because this information is disseminating it in to the public, and back to the idea that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And suddenly, you've got the taste for it. I think COVID, the one good thing about it was that we began to realize that some environments we don't want to go near, like the office, and others we want to be in. And in fact, the other thing that excites me, globally, it has been a bestseller. It's been a bestseller in all categories in Amazon. And in fact, it's published by University of Toronto Press, a major publisher. But it is their number one seller, in this catalog of this period, meaning that where it's beginning to disseminate the information, and that's what's very important to me.
And maybe in that context, then architectural education will start to potentially shift as well.
It
Um,
is.
and actually, I think so. Kevin's just posted something, but I'm gonna use your statement of once you've seen something, you can't unsee it. And I think, Kevin, if you don't mind me saying so, I think for those of us who've become aware of the mitochondrial connection with infrared light, once you become aware of it, you can't unsee it. It's there. It's a fundamental part of our being. But the reason that I'm bringing Kevin up again here is that he's just mentioned that there is a paper, and Kevin, if you're happy to share it later, or maybe I'll connect you with Tye, and it's the effects of near-infrared radiation in ambient lighting on cognitive performance, emotion, and heart rate variability. So there is a correlation between heart rate variability and infrared. And as we know, we've stripped some of the goodness out of artificial light sources. So our interior environment is to a certain degree depleted
Yeah.
already from being able to deliver that from
Well,
from different angles, from a lighting energy perspective, but also, as we talked about just a minute ago, or you mentioned, the glazing systems are being developed, and I understand we're trying to reduce the heat gain, but actually there's something else that's being taken away.
yeah, and I'd really like to see that paper. In fact, I'd love to. The three of us should have a call together, which would be amazing. But let me add another piece into that around light and performance. And so it can be light, the quality of light. There was a study uh, of student performance as it related to daylight coming into space. And I don't know exactly what the windows were like, but it was around daylight as opposed to glare. Big study, you can look it up. It was on the west coast of North America. Looked at 2,000 classrooms and 20,000 students, like a lot of kids. And the kids that were in classrooms that had a better quality of light, and I think you could go into daylight too, and certainly we know daylight has the movement aspect, which is very important on stimulation. But just that element, the students that had a good quality of light as opposed to glare, they performed 25% better on reading or English or similar, and 20% better on math. So if I'm an architect and I come to you and I'm going to design your office building, and I say to you, with what I do, I can increase the performance of your team by 25%. Would that be a value to you? Back to the $1, the 5 and the 200. But say I'm wrong. Say it's only 20%. But let's go a step further and say I'm really wrong and the improvement is only 15%. Would that be of value? Maybe if it's 5%. The problem is a lot of the environments that we have, forget about absenteeism, that nobody wants to go to the office. There's presenteeism around the environments that people are in because the environments are sucking the life out of you and the team's only performing at 70 or 60 or whatever percentage, but it's not about above the 100%. It's these environments or the pathogenic view. So I think all of this stuff that's out there it's back to creating the conditions of which we can thrive and prosper and deal with a lot of these challenging issues that are swirling around us in our business, our societies, everywhere.
And I think that then comes back to what we were talking about earlier a little bit, in terms of aging populations, productivity, businesses chasing productivity, nations chasing productivity, and our environment it clearly has a significant impact on delivering that productivity. But maybe we don't invest in it enough at the front end. We're concentrating on value engineering or cost reduction too much, and not focusing on the long term value that environment delivers.
But I don't want to throw it into a cost issue because it's not a cost issue. It is back to that menu. it's back to your shopping list. Is that, I mean, our process that we do is very important. Is we start off and we say, why are we building this building? With 40 people that are involved in the building. And we say, why are we building? And the first answer is, well, we need to hold this many people or this amount of space. We say, okay, what else? Well, it's got to be effective. Okay, what else? Well, it's got to increase collaboration. Okay, what else? Well, it's going to reinforce our brand. Okay, and our values. Okay, what else? And so we put that together really sort of like as a balanced scorecard. And we use that to judge every option that comes up beyond there. Along the way, you're going to have to make a decision on where you spend your money. But is collaboration of your team really, really important? Probably is. And so we say, okay, we can't sacrifice these things. So how are we smarter and smarter and better? None of my clients have all the money in the world. In fact, we go through the value management all the time, but ensuring it's tied to not it's tied to the values side, not just the values side. Meaning that we have to ensure that what we're doing, every dollar, every ruble, every pound, euro we spend is reinforcing these elements. There's no more money to spend, but it's back to avoiding the ultra processed nature as opposed to that smoothie we talked about that's packed full of minerals and vitamins.
I've got a question from Sanjot. Thank you very much for joining today, Sanjot. So Sanjot says, as much as constructing health relies on design elements such as materials, air quality, etc., most of your work really uses a lot of wood. Can you say that materials, especially wood, are more important than other elements in designing for health?
Let's go back to building relationships and multimodal stimulation. And so let's look at some example. Why are we using wood today? Well, we're using wood because of its ecological benefits, right? It's a carbon sink. 1 cubic meter of wood effectively holds the carbon that 150 cars will drive in the span of a year. That's really important. We should use it. Why else is wood important if we look at health through the health lens? In a Canadian context, is that there's a lot of small communities that the timber industry is very important for good jobs, mills and productivity. And you can go through the whole food chain on that. When we look at the tariffs and the issues around Trump, ensuring that our industries, from not only harvesting the wood, milling the wood, turning it into CLT, engineering it and building it in buildings, there's a whole societal health aspect around that. Let's go to mind health. Wood's very interesting, tons of studies on it. They're in my book, that if you're in a wood environment, and interestingly, it looks at the amount of wood, but just the visual aspects of wood lowers your blood pressure, your heart rate, on and on. So it changes your biology around it. That's just looking at it. We know if we look at wood, that we imagine something that's growing. We connect. There's a biophilic aspect around that. The interesting thing is, when you go into a sauna and you smell the eucalyptus or the cedar, that's another scent here. And what that does around, again, back to your heart rate, all of those things, that has a physiological, a powerful aspect. But let's take it a step further. What happens if there's wood that you're walking on? The sound of the wood that you're walking on, that tonal aspect, that's very different than concrete or steel. And in fact, interestingly, very interesting studies, that there is theta and beta waves. One is positive, one is negative. That's sound going into your ears and your mind processing it. Walking on wood has the positive sound aspects, meaning that just the sound of it also has positive physiological health aspects, meaning that we shouldn't be using wood just for its ecological aspects, which are important, but it changes your physiology. The other thing is, if you put your hand on wood, what happens is you have that, it's not taking energy out of you, not taking either heat or cold from it. Put your hand on steel, or walk out today and stick your tongue here to a steel post. Something else is going to happen to you. But what it's doing is it's sucking energy or it's pushing it into you. Wood isn't doing that. So there's a real physiological, biological, human health aspect, which we're in fact really trying to get out there, because it's more than just the ecological side. Back to the idea that it's an enricher, it's an environmental enricher, as opposed to ultra processed. In fact, as you've said equally so importantly, that it begins, it's not just feeding you, it's nourishing you.
Thank you. Excellent answer. Um, we're close to time. I don't know if there are any other questions that anybody has who wants to sort of throw them in now before we close off.
There's thoughts, so there's a few thoughts I'd just like to
Yep.
leave at some point.
No, we'll fire away. We'll see if some questions come about.
In the book, what it tries to do is gives people the tools um, to walk deeper into some of these subjects. And as a side note, there's a glossary of terms at the back um, that is there to be helpful. There's 50 recommended books I've read, probably read 100 on them, and those are 50 that if you want to deepen your knowledge, they're there. But what the book is trying to do is to provoke you to think a little bit, and it begins to pose some questions. Again, what causes health? What if health was the basis for judging every public space in every building? What if we stop tolerating design that causes boredom and disease, that word again with a hyphen, and depression? More importantly, how do buildings make us feel? But how do they make us feel better? And back to the idea that we used to have a salutogenic view, a holistic, on focusing on the origins and the causes of mental, physical, and societal health. But architecture and design have frequently followed suit. But recently, however, with this sort of Western medicine view, not that I'm slogging that, but it has embraced pathogens and the causes of disease. Why? And what can we do actively to shift our view to an asset-based mind health view? And how can we use that for one sole reason: to construct health? One sole goal is to create the conditions of which we can prosper and design as a result of the act of placemaking.
We don't have any further questions, but that is a fantastic way to close off. And Tye, I really want to thank you for your time today. I think it's a real shame that we won't get to meet next week when you're in London, but I'd love the opportunity to meet you next time. I think we're meeting again for a round table in the not too distant future. I think that's going to be really exciting. So yes, I want to thank you very much for your time. It's been brilliant.
Looking forward to spend more time with you, and I think the next time, back to the food subject, I think we
Yes.
need to get the restaurant sorted out.
Definitely,
Looking
and we'll have to
forward to it.
we'll have to choose it wisely. We'll have to choose it wisely. So really, just a close off from my side. The next talk will be in March, and we'll be talking to Simon Carter, who wrote a book called Rise and Shine, and it's a sociological study on our connection to sunlight. So we're back to light, but I'm really grateful that we spent some time talking about salutogenic design, salutogenesis in general. I'm wholeheartedly on board, Tye, because I think we absolutely have to do better. So with that said, I want to thank you once again. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to continuing our conversation whichever way. And I will, if you're happy, I will introduce you to Kevin, and Kevin, I'm sure, will share the paper. Kevin knows a huge amount about the lighting industry, light in general, and the qualities that come from that. So thank you very much. Thank you for your
Please,
time. Thank you for joining us.
please
And
do, and nice to share.
yeah, no, it's been brilliant. It's been brilliant. Thank you.